Now that we have a good understanding about how to go about building a property portfolio, the next thing I would talk to Mr. and Mrs. X about is that they can't get to their second, third, fourth property until they get to their first. And they understand at this point that the way to build their net worth is through the accumulation of four or more properties over the long term. However, the other side of the coin is that they need to understand how much this property is going to cost them in order to hold on to it for the long term to allow the market to do the work for them. Now, again, I want to reiterate that this is a hypothetical situation, and prior to making any investment decisions, you should consult a licensed professional. However, in this hypothetical scenario, if we have a look at Mr. and Mrs. X's situation and just recap, we have Mr. X earning $90,000, Mrs. X about $35,000 a year. They've got a couple $100,000 worth of equity in their principal place of residence, as well as some savings which they can use as a deposit for their first investment property. So what we would do is first work out the kind of funds that they would need in order to acquire their investment property. So it's going to be the capital cost. So if we're going to assume that they purchase a $500,000 apartment in the Gold Coast, they might have to pay maybe $1,200, $1,500, something like that worth of solicitor fees, as well as just under $16,000 worth of stamp duty. So if we assume that Mr. and Mrs. X are able to put down about $117,000 in terms of a deposit, they would need to borrow about $400,000. Where they get this $117,000 from is from a combination of drawing out the equity from their principal place of residence, as well as a combination of their savings that they hold in cash. So now we need to understand exactly how much it's going to cost them to hold on to this property. So what we do is we assume an interest rate of about 5%. So that means on their $400,000 borrowing, their interest on their loan that they need to pay is about $20,000 per annum. The property may cost them around about $2,000 a year in combined council and water rates. Because the building or investment that they're looking at has quite a high level of amenities, such as pools and gyms, etc., they might be up for about $3,500 worth of strata, and they would also have to pay about $400 per annum in letting fees to the managing agent because they've chosen not to manage the property themselves. They don't want to be getting calls in the middle of the night talking about broken water heaters or anything like that. And they would probably have to pay about $250 or $300 a year in landlord protection insurance. They don't need to pay for building insurance because this is an apartment block, and the building insurance is covered in their strata fees. So the total outgoings for their property is about just under $28,000 or $536 per week. Now we're going to assume a very conservative rental income of around about 4%. So we're going to assume that the property only is able to rent out at $400 a week. And this is very important because in all of the figures in determining how much it's going to cost us to hold on to this property, we want to approach it from a very conservative figure. If the figures end up being what we predict, well, that's better for Mr. and Mrs. X. So on top of this, we're going to assume that the property is vacant around about 3% of the time. And the reason that we choose 3% is that on average, a leasing agreement for a tenant is about 12 months. And 3% assumes that the property is going to be vacant about 2 weeks per year. So if we change tenants every year, it might take us a couple of weeks to find a new tenant and have them move in. So therefore, we assume our cash flow at a vacancy rate at 3%. Because the property is in the Gold Coast, we're going to assume a property management rate. So for people to manage the property, find tenants, ensure the rent comes in, all those sorts of things, of about 8.8%. So all of this means the actual rent that we assume in our cash flow, or working out how much it's going to cost Mr. and Mrs. X to hold on to the property is about $388. Carrying forward our total outgoings from here of just under $28,000, our rental income is just over $20,000. It costs Mr. and Mrs. X pre-tax about $7,700 a year in order to hold on to this property and build the capital growth for the long term. However, there are some additional tax benefits associated with holding on to an investment property. So if we bring forward our shortfall of about $7,700 a week, because it's a brand new apartment, they're able to claim the maximum depreciation in combination with their shortfall, or the difference between the rent and the mortgage that they're paying. So they get some tax deductions totaling around about $19,000 per year. Because Mr. X is earning the higher income out of the two, we can divert most of the tax savings across to Mr. X, because he's going to be able to get the maximum amount of tax deductions. So if we assume he's paying his $90,000, earning his $90,000, it's estimated that he would be paying about $23,000 in tax. But because of all the deductions from the shortfall, or the difference between the rent and the mortgage, as well as in addition to the depreciation that Mr. and Mrs. X is able to claim, Mr. X's taxable or assessable income reduces to about $72,000, meaning he's only paying about $17,000 worth of tax. So what does this mean overall? Each year, Mr. and Mrs. X are saving around about $6,500 a year in tax, or $126 a week. And depending on Mr. and Mrs. X's situation, if they were PAYG employees, i.e. they're a normal employee, they would be able to, with the help of their accountant, file for what's called an income tax variation. So what that basically means is the accountant writes a letter to the tax office and says, Mr. Tax Office, Mr. and Mrs. X are going to get all these deductions at the end of the year. Can you please authorize Mr. and Mrs. X's employer to not hold as much income tax for them and pay them more in their pay packet? And then the employer is able to do that with the authority from the ATO. And essentially, Mr. and Mrs. X end up each week with more money in their paychecks, allowing them to service the $7,700 a year that the property's costing them to hold. So they don't have to wait till the end of the year in order to get their $6,500 tax back. And what does this mean overall? Well, it means overall their total weekly investment after tax is going to be in the vicinity of $22 a week in order to hold on to this investment property. Now, this $22 a week, overall, if you look at who's paying what, rent's covering 72% of the investment property, or the holding cost. The tax office is holding about 24% of the total cost of the investment property, and the investors, Mr. and Mrs. X, only need to chip in about 4% of the total investment cost.